Hello sewing people of the internet. This is episode 3 of my backpack tutorial. In this episode I'm going to show you how to assemble the main sub-assemblies of the backpack, the back panel, the front panel, and the gusset, before they will get assembled into the actual shape of a backpack in the next video. If you haven't looked at the length of time on this video, this is a very long video. There's a lot to cover here. This stage is where all the work is. Cutting out pieces doesn't take very long. Sewing those pieces together into the shape of a backpack, that doesn't take very long. But getting all these details in place where they need to be at the right time, that's where all of the work and thought goes into a project like this. So bear with me. If you want to make a pack like this, this part's the important part. One other thing to note, in episode 0 I said that I was going to be using my Sailrite Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine, and I'll probably still end up using it some, but I got a new toy. Come on. This very old and well-used Consew 206 RB industrial walking foot sewing machine, and I'm going to be using it just because I want to. As I said in episode 0, if you're using a domestic sewing machine, there may be some choices that you need to make this more feasible for you. So just because you see this machine accomplish something doesn't mean that you should try it with your standard domestic machine. However, as I've preached repeatedly, you can do an awful lot with a vintage domestic sewing machine, so please don't feel like you need to have this to make something like what we're going to make in this video. I'm starting out by making the interior pocket organization for the front pocket of the backpack. The back panel I've already done and just put a double fold hem on the top, and I did a 1/2 inch or so hem. I just did this by eye, just by folding it. There are a number of ways that you could accomplish this. You can use a folder that attaches to your machine and creates that hem. I actually have one of those, and it's just such a pain in the neck to use sometimes. I don't bother. You could fold this and pin it, you could staple it, you could tape it. There's all kinds of ways you can do this. I just folded mine and held it with clips and then sewed it down. As I said, I've already done this one. I'm going to show you how I did it on the front part of the organizer panel. Now that I have the hem sewn into both of these pieces, I next need to place the front piece on top of the back piece, and I'm going to sew it on these lines, and I think you might be able to see these, but it's pretty light. I used an orange colored pen, just an artist colored pencil, to mark these lines, and I'm using a thread that's marked as red, and it kind of looks red on the spool, but as I think you can see, I mean, it's a great match for this orange canvas, so it should be the subtle look that I'm looking for. I didn't want a contrasting thread for this part of it. So what I'll do next is sew down each of these lines, and that will create a couple of pockets for pins, a larger pocket that could be for like a flashlight or a multi-tool, and then a bigger pocket to hold maybe a small notepad. Hey, guess who forgot to hit record before sewing all this stuff for you? Well, anyway, so now I have the 3 pin sleeves, multi-tool or flashlight pocket, and what will be the pocket for the notepad once this gets sewn in at the end. Next, I prepared the front pocket zipper by sewing on a zipper extension and a zipper garage. I made mine out of bicycle inner tube, and I'll explain how I made them in greater detail later in the video. This is the time to sew on any embellishments you want on the front of the front pocket, like this label my friend David Sr. sent me. Thanks, David. Another option is a Velcro panel for your morale patches.
Hello, sewing people of the internet.
Next, I folded a double hem where the pocket piece is attached to the zipper. I used a double hem to avoid fraying. This should ensure my backpack will last a long time. Then I just sewed the pieces to the zipper.
Make sure to orient the zipper so that it opens in the direction you want it to. I placed the 400 denier pack cloth piece on the back of the pocket assembly. I folded the tops of the pieces in toward each other to create a finished edge and to protect the raw edges to prevent fraying. I sewed a double row of stitches on the top, and then I sewed around the perimeter. To sew around the perimeter, I switched to another machine that had black thread in it, but honestly, I didn't really need to do that.
So now I have the front pocket assembly completed. That's going to eventually get attached to the front panel. The closure strap for the bag is attached to the front panel. I just sewed a box. I didn't bother with a box X because I don't think it's necessary for this. You can do that if you want, but I just sewed a big box. And I measured up about 9 inches from the bottom so that the stitching will be below the opening for the pocket, so you won't see it. So these are good to go for now, and now I want to move on to the back panel. But before I do that, I think we need to talk about seam allowances. I mentioned in episode 0 that I wasn't going to spend a lot of time talking about the fundamentals of sewing for this project, but I think seam allowance is important to emphasize. So the seam allowance is the material that is outside of the stitch line, the excess material that's left over. If you're used to working with other materials that you could maybe fasten with glue or nails or welding, then you may not be accustomed to having an amount of material left over outside of the joint. But with fabric, it's necessary to have some extra material. There are 3 reasons why I think observing seam allowance is important. One is dimension. For example, for this backpack project, I've specified a 1/2 inch seam allowance for all of the panels. If you sew less than a 1/2 inch or more than a 1/2 inch, then the dimensions for the project aren't going to come out exactly right. Now, for something like a backpack, that's not terribly important, but if you're trying to make something fit a specific object, it could mean the difference between it fitting or not fitting. Another reason seam allowance is important is for the structure of what you're making. So as an example, I've sewn 2 pieces of 1680 denier ballistic nylon, one of the toughest fabrics I have, together with the same size 69 nylon thread that I'm using for this project, and I've sewn it as close to the edge as possible, so like no seam allowance at all. I sewed these 2 pieces of 1680 denier with the same thread, but with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Yeah, it's not going anywhere. The third reason why observing the proper seam allowance is important is for the cosmetics of your project. So here I'm simulating sewing 2 pieces together that have been stitched in previous operations, and on this piece I failed to observe the proper seam allowance and sewed too far in, so that when the project is turned out and finished, you'll see this ugly wavy stitch line showing. That's not what we're looking for. You can avoid that by making sure you don't exceed the seam allowance when you're sewing assemblies together, and make sure that you don't take too little seam allowance on your final stitches. On this backpack project, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that means when I'm sewing assemblies like this pocket assembly together, I need to keep the stitches where I've joined these assemblies together in that seam allowance, so less than 1/2 inch away from the edge. So when I sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance, those stitches will remain concealed within the seam allowance. I can use any method I need to permanently or temporarily attach multiple pieces into assemblies by using staples or glue or stitches. As long as I keep them in the seam allowance, you won't see them. If I need to mark the center point by cutting a notch in this, which we'll be doing later, as long as I keep it within the seam allowance, you won't see it. Alright, that's seam allowances. Let's move on to the back panel.
The first thing I needed to do was to cut the 2 pieces of 400 denier pack cloth that I forgot to cut in the last episode.
So first I'm going to deal with the sandwich that makes up the exterior of the back panel and the first piece of foam and pack cloth. We're going to be attaching a zipper to one side of this panel, and that zipper of course adds some width to the panel, so we need to take that back away. And we also need to conceal our raw edges, so we can do both at one time by just taking a 1/2 inch fold, and I'm folding both edges, the edge of the 400 denier pack cloth and the edge of the canvas, to the inside, and that way they'll be protected and I don't have to do any other edge treatment to prevent this material from fraying. This 400 denier pack cloth doesn't fray very badly, but the wax canvas definitely will. To make a 1 inch fold, I've marked a line 1 inch from the edge on the wrong side of this piece, and all I have to do is fold the edge to meet that line. To make the zipper the correct length for the panel, I've added these extensions on either end of the zipper. I made mine out of bicycle inner tube, but you could just use canvas or any other fabric that you're using on your project. The extension on the bottom of the zipper is just going to be a flat extension, and the one on the top is going to make a little zipper garage like we did on the front panel, just so that the zipper can be tucked out of the way and have a little bit of extra water protection. One reason this needs to be constructed in this way is the strap that will affix the backpack straps to the back panel is going to be sewn on about here, and I want the zipper to stop below that point. If you're using the same dimensions that I am, I cut this zipper at 16 inches. So here's kind of a sneak preview of how this back panel and computer pocket works. I've got the 2 pieces clipped together here so you can kind of see. But, hi. So there's the outer sandwich of wax canvas, foam, and the 400 denier pack cloth. And right now that's clipped to the inner sandwich of 400 denier pack cloth, foam, and 400 denier pack cloth. And they'll be joined by this zipper, so once it's all sewn together and you unzip it, you'll have the laptop compartment that's finished with 400 denier pack cloth on the inside. However, we can't sew around the perimeter to permanently join these together because I still have to sew on the backpack straps, which get joined to this panel by this piece of webbing. So now we have to make the straps.
First, attach the horizontal accessory strap to the good side of the front piece of the strap pad. I put mine 10 inches down from the top of the pad, and that puts it a little bit below my shoulder when I'm wearing the pack. Next, sew the front and back pieces together, right sides together, with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Only sew around 3 sides and leave the top end open. Turn the assembly right side out. I find a drumstick helps.
So probably the most challenging part of making your own backpack straps is getting the foam inside the strap, or at least doing it the way I'm doing it, which is called the inside out method. I've sewn the pieces together inside out, and now I have to put the foam in. Another method of doing this is to just sew the foam and the 2 exterior pieces together all as one unit, and then put binding around the outside, like this. But I didn't want this project to have any binding at all. And honestly, I like the way the straps come out when they're done this way better than that. Anyway, there's no real way to make this super easy to get this foam inside here because you want a nice snug fit so that the foam fills the strap nicely. There may be some tricks that I'm not aware of. Make sure you check the comments for other people's suggestions, and if you have a suggestion, put it there. But while I was filming this, I actually hit upon a method that worked better for me than anything else I've tried, so I'll show you. If you ever made hammock whoopee slings out of am steel, this will seem very familiar to you. Just that simple, just that quick. You might find, like I did, that once you have the foam fully inserted into your strap, that the foam is a little bit too long. You really want it probably a good inch, inch and a half below the end of the strap so that you're not having to sew the foam into the back pad. That just will make it really bulky. So if you find that's the case, that's no problem. Just cut it off to the appropriate length.
I sewed the strap adjusters onto my shoulder straps before attaching the straps to the pads. It's not a big deal to do later if you prefer. And no, I don't smoke, but I think Zippos are kind of cool.
So now I want to attach the webbing strap, which is really what will be holding the weight of the backpack on your shoulders, to the pad, which is really just there for comfort. I'm going to start by sewing the end of the padded strap assembly closed, and I'll also sew the webbing into the end at the same time.
At the bottom of the strap assembly, I sewed the webbing strap to the pad with a box X stitch. I did this mostly by hand wheeling the machine to keep the box X nice and neat since I'm using contrasting stitching.
So now the straps are ready to attach to the piece of webbing that will attach the straps to the back panel. And I also want to attach the grab handle. And you could make a much more complicated padded grab handle if you want to. I've found that a piece of webbing works fine for me. Sorry, Chase Reeves, but I'm just going to use a piece of webbing. But whatever you're putting on, this is where you would put it on for this backpack. I found what works for me and is simple is I'm just going to attach the webbing strap for the handle to the ends of the straps and then sew the straps to the webbing just to keep everything in place. I found that if I space the straps about 2 inches apart, that works well for me. It's comfortable. You may want to pin this or otherwise temporarily attach it and try it on before you fully sew everything, if you want to see if there's a different spacing that works better for your body. Oops, I did it again. So I made this mistake when I made the prototype backpack too, and apparently I didn't learn from it, but I put this on incorrectly. The way this works is the straps are sewn to the webbing and then the whole thing is kind of folded over or put on upside down so that when it's on the pack, it's kind of in this configuration. So I need to attach this handle this way, not this way. I wanted to cover a couple of details that really didn't get caught in the construction, and also to kind of reiterate that I'm showing you how I made this backpack, and my intent is for this to be an inspiration for you to make your own backpack inspired by this, but not necessarily an exact replica of this. So just know there's dozens of ways to do, well, pretty much most of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to show you some ways I like to do it, but there are definitely more ways. And if you know a different way to do any of this stuff, post it in the comments. So for the zipper for this pack, I used a waterproof zipper, and I made these zipper extensions. I don't know what the correct term for these is, so I'm calling them zipper extensions. and this one on this side is a zipper garage, meaning that the slider goes underneath it. And that helps provide a little bit of extra weather protection and a cool look if you like that look. On the prototype pack, I put a flap over the zipper and I didn't use a water resistant zipper. And to do this, I just used a wider flap than I did on the pack that we're currently making and just folded it under when I sewed it on. There are a couple of reasons to use the zipper extensions. You don't have to make them out of inner tube like I did here. You could just use the fabric that you're making your pack out of, or you could use something like the interior color for a nice contrast, although this particular fabric doesn't have any weatherproof qualities to it. Probably the main benefit is by sewing the zipper extension to the zipper and leaving the zipper out of the main seam that you're sewing, you reduce the bulk of the main seam where the zipper gets sewn into the body of the backpack. And considering there's already going to be multiple layers of fabric there, and in my case it's also pretty much where the water bottle carrier goes, anything I can do to reduce bulk will make it easier for me to sew through that bulk. The other thing it does is just give a nice professional appearance. There's nothing wrong with not doing this. It makes a perfectly good zipper opening, but to me, when I see a bag that has these extensions on it, it just shows that a little bit more thought and effort went into the making of the bag, I guess. So I like the way it looks. So I don't have a real pattern or process developed for making these. I usually just take some small pieces of scrap. Basically for the flat side, I just take a rectangle, as long as it's long enough. I don't think it really matters how long it is. I'd like to sew it onto the zipper, maybe ½ an inch from the end of the zipper. You don't want to put it right at the end. And I just fold it in half, put it on top, and then sew it down. And you can sew 1 or 2 rows, whatever you like. And that's really all there is to it. You don't have to sew down the edges alongside the zipper, because when you sew the zipper into the project, it'll get captured as part of that seam. For the zipper garage, you basically want a little trapezoid. Is that the right name for this shape? What I do is I just take a rectangle, fold it in half, and then cut it into this shape. And the narrow end needs to be about the same width as the zipper. It doesn't have to be that precise because it's going to be covered up. And basically, I always fold it in half and sew the fold down. Again, you don't necessarily have to do that, but I just think it makes it look better. And again, you don't want to sew it directly at the end of the zipper, but you want to have it hang off a ½ inch, an inch, whatever. And then I usually sew it at the end of the zipper with some overhang so that it's attached. And then when you sew the edges to the edge of the zipper tape, that gives you this 3-dimensional opening. Thanks, buddy. Probably the simplest way to deal with a zipper is to just separate the 2 pieces and sew them on one at a time and skip the zipper extensions. And that's totally fine to do and is definitely faster. And as you can see, for like a simple pouch like this, the extra bulk of the zipper and the seam isn't really any big deal. But when you've got zipper and inner tube and canvas and multiple layers, it can get a bit bulky. If you don't want to mess with zippers at all, you can always do a hook and loop fastener or snaps or some other closure. By the way, if you want to do a pocket with some 3rd dimension quality to it for some more volume, I made this pocket on the manliest yoga bag in the world, and I have a video for that shows how I made this pocket if you want to check that out. I also wanted to cover some of the details of the back panel and the straps. On the back panel, I sewed these channels or stitches into the foam of the back panel. I just did mine at a 3-inch spacing because that worked out right to make it look kind of even. And I was pretty careful when I got to the end, so I started on this side and sewed over here to where the zipper is, and I carefully walked the machine up to this stitch line where the zipper is sewn in, so the stitches terminate right in that seam, or as close as possible to it, just to give it a neater appearance. Some manufacturers claim that putting the channels in the back foam helps reduce the heat and make you sweat less when you're carrying it. I don't know how effective any of that really is. I did this mostly for the appearance of it. I've carried a lot of backpacks, and I live in Florida where it's pretty hot and humid a lot of the time. I've never noticed one being more or less sweaty than the other. But, you know, do your own research and do whatever design you think works best for you. And I've also seen some people do some really cool artistic stuff with this, sewing like skulls and different designs in the back. So there's a lot of things you could do with this. It doesn't just have to be some straight lines. So the way the straps attach is, if you lay the straps so that the back of the straps, the part that is touching your body when you're wearing them, is facing up, then this piece of webbing gets sewn across them, and that's what attaches to the backpack. It goes in this configuration so that then the straps go in their correct orientation. The way these straps are designed, this webbing is carrying all the weight. This webbing has a breaking strength of, I think it's something like 1,500 or 1,600 pounds. I'm not going to go look it up, but it's a lot. It's way more than it needs to be for something like this. So even though it looks like just some thin webbing, it's more than ample to carry the weight. The pad is just there to be a pad. You could run this webbing inside the padding or underneath this outer layer if you didn't want to see the webbing. You can put multiple of these horizontal accessory straps. I use these just to hang a carabiner or maybe my sunglasses from. You're a big help, man. So you could put as many of those as you want. I don't have this webbing sewn down to the padded strap at all, except for at the end. The sky's the limit when it comes to making backpack straps, so just know that what I've done here isn't the only way to do it. This is just a way that I've found that works for me. And I sewed the strap to the pad at the end with a box X stitch, really honestly, just because it looks cool. There's not really any stress on this point that would require this much stitching. It just looks neat. So now to complete the back panel, I just need to attach the flanges on the bottom where the bottom of the straps will be attached. The pieces I'm using here are about 7.5 inches square. Yours don't have to be that size though, they just need to be squares somewhere around that size. Just fold them in half to make a triangle, and then fold that triangle in half. I inserted my webbing about 2 inches into the triangles. With the webbing trapped in the middle, sew down the fold. Then secure the webbing with a box X stitch. So now my strap attachments are ready to attach to the back panel, but I want to remember to put the hip belt attachment loops on underneath them. So I've basted the front pocket to the front panel to make that a complete assembly. And all I mean by basting is I've stitched it on. I used the longest stitched length so it's easier to remove if I need to remove it. And those stitches aren't intended to structurally hold these pieces together. They're just to hold it together while I sew everything together permanently. I've also basted the back panel to the inner panel with the foam in it for the laptop sleeve. So now this is a completed assembly. The straps are attached top and bottom, and it just needs to be sewn into the gusset. The gusset is the final main component that I need to make for the backpack. The gusset itself is just this strip that we already cut out, but it needs the water bottle pockets on each side, and it needs to have the inner tube on the bottom, because that's what I'm going to do with mine. If you're not doing inner tube on the bottom, then you don't need to do anything else to this. One option you could consider if you want is to sew another layer of canvas on, so that there's an extra layer of protection to make it last longer. Before I make the water bottle pockets and the inner tube piece for the bottom, I want to go ahead and mark some notches onto the gusset. I'm going to use those notches to mark the center, the bottom corners, and the tops of the water bottle pockets. I've shown this in other videos, but to find the center, I'm just going to fold it exactly in half, carefully matching up the corners, and then right at that fold, I'll just make a little notch. And again, I just want to make sure I keep that within the 1/2 inch seam allowance so that when this whole thing is sewn together, that notch doesn't show. I'm going to put notches on both sides. The width of the pieces that make up the backpack before it's all sewn together is 12 inches. So I'm going to mark 6 inches from the center on either side, and that'll describe the width of the panel and mark the corners for me. And I'm just marking it with tailor's chalk just so I have a mark to cut, and then I'll cut a notch after I've got a mark here. I want to have the water bottle pocket tops be in line with the top of the front pocket, and that's 10 3/4 inches from the bottom. So on the gusset, I'm going to mark 10 3/4 inches from the marks that identify the corners.
So the notches mark the top of the water bottle pockets, the bottom corner, center, bottom corner, and top of the bottle pocket.
Now that I have the gusset marked, I can turn my attention to the water bottle pockets. To make pockets like the ones I'm making, you'll also need some pretty strong elastic. I just bought this at the regular fabric store. I don't know any of the specifications on it. I just felt the ones that felt the strongest to me, and that worked. I had some white elastic that was less strong, and that I tried that one, so that didn't work at all. So you definitely need some reasonably strong stuff.
Make sure these pieces are oriented correctly. They should be 10 3/4 inches high and 10 inches wide. Fold a double hem into the top edge of the pocket, then sew that hem down. Then use the elastic as a guide to fold a channel into the top of the pocket.
So I want my elastic pieces to be the same width as the gusset. And I could measure it, it's just easier just to hold it up to the gusset. And now it's the right length. What I want to do now is insert the piece of elastic into the channel that we made. And then once I've got it inserted fully, I want to secure the end at the edge by sewing a couple of rows of stitches. Quick tip here, I got too enthusiastic with my chopstick and pushed it a little bit, or pushed the elastic in a little bit too far. These things are forceps, I think, are very handy. Is this a clamp? Maybe this is a clamp. If you're a surgeon, post in the comments what this is.
Since the elastic is not as wide as the pocket, I use my hemostat forceps clamp things to stretch it to the other end. Needle nose pliers work too. So I had a little problem with some lost footage, but basically after you sew the elastic into the channel on the top of the water bottle pocket and sew the end of the elastic down so it's stretched between the two sides, it pulls it into this gather that you probably can't see because I made the brilliant decision to make this black. Anyway, once you do that, what I did was I found the center point of this pocket and then measured out 1.5 inches from each side, so it would have a 3-inch pleat. And then you just fold it in half and sew the fold down, and that gives you this pleat for the bottle pocket. Now to install the pocket on the gusset, I'll line up the top of the pocket with the mark that I made that aligns with the top of the front pocket. And to give the 3-dimensional structure to the pocket, I'll line up the edges with the edge of the gusset and then just lay the pleat flat. And I'll just sew across here, and that'll leave this open. And just as an added measure of security to make sure that this doesn't pull out from the weight of a bottle, I'm going to sew a second row of stitching. And by the way, I could have switched to black thread here since this isn't going to be seen, but I have just as much of the orange thread as I do of the black thread, so it didn't really matter. At this point, I could just leave the pockets loose like this and wait to sew it down until I'm ready to sew everything together. But what ends up happening is you end up with a lot of layers that you're trying to hold together while you're going through the sewing machine. So I find it easier to just go ahead and stitch these down, and then when I'll sew it again close to the edge so I'm not coming up to that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then when I sew the 1/2 inch seam allowance, it won't be affected by this stitching, and all this stitching will be concealed. So I make these pockets this way because I carry a big water bottle with me all the time, so I need something that can accommodate that. If you don't need that, then you can always just make the pocket a flat piece of material the same width as the gusset, and that would accommodate, you know, something like a smaller water bottle or a coffee mug or something like that. Other options, this isn't a water bottle pocket, I made this to carry my phone when I'm running, but I just used some Lycra spandex material, and you could make a pocket out of that. You'd want to find some sturdy Lycra and maybe fold it over and use 2 layers, or line it with something. But that could work for a more versatile pocket that could carry a wider range of objects. You could do, hi buddy, that's really helpful, good boy. You could also do a mesh pocket, and that also has some stretch to it that will let you carry a variety of items. Or you could do Pals webbing for molly attachments. I actually use the water bottle holder from that pack on my messenger bag right now because I haven't had a chance to make one for that. And that's an advantage to having Pals webbing, is you can move items from one bag to another or change them out for a different pouch. If I didn't need this pouch on here but needed something else, I can easily remove it instead of having a permanent pocket. The last thing I need to do for the gusset is make the section of motorcycle inner tube that's going to make up the bottom of the bag. If you aren't going to do the inner tube or another layer of canvas on the bag, then where these bottle pockets are attached, you would want to roll these under and sew them down so you have a nice finished edge. I'm going to cover the raw edge with the inner tube, so I didn't need to do that. So the piece of inner tube I'm going to need to cut is 7 inches wide, the width of the gusset, and then I want it to be long enough to be folded under so I cover the raw edge of the inner tube and overlap with the bottoms of the pockets. So I'm going to cut my inner tube at 18 inches. Alright, I've attached the inner tube section to the bottom.
I didn't film a lot of that, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of how to make this work because there's a lot of finessing involved that I think is beyond the scope of this project, and this is already the longest video I've ever made. So if you have questions about inner tube, you can post them in the comments, and eventually maybe I'll make a video about some tricks you can use to work with this stuff. But if you decide to do it, just know, like, it ain't easy. There's going to be some effort involved in getting this to fit. Alright, so that's the front panel assembly, the back panel assembly with the straps, and the gusset assembly. The only thing I haven't made yet is the extension collar. We'll talk about that in the next video. I think I mentioned a video or two back that the one on the prototype is too long, and I'll show you what length I decided on and how you can play around with options. And also in the next video, we'll talk about some different options for closures if you don't want to do the roll top at all. I know this is a really long video. If you're still watching, thank you for sticking with it. I wanted to get as much of the detail about this as I could into the video. If you have questions, if there's something I missed, post it in the comments section. And in the next video, we'll wrap up this project and make a pretty badass backpack. If you're not a subscriber, yada yada, you know the deal. Thank you for watching.